Ulta comes around on New Year's, and then so quickly have MLK Day come up here. It's just kind of disruptive. I don't want to seem like a Grinch, but the first part of the year is hard to get things done. Anyway, before we go any further, I wanted to say that if you didn't know, and I'm sure you probably do, Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, passed this week. Great guy. I mean, I've listened to some of his Wed Stuff, Coffee with Scott Adams, and then some other things that he's done. And of course, I love Dilbert. I mean, what a great take on corporate culture that is. And he was really unfairly canceled during the time when the cancellation was in its highest epoch, I guess. And he just kept pushing on. He was a great guy. He had some great ideas. If you ever get a chance to read his book, and I have it, it's, let's see, How to Succeed by Failing All the Time, something like that. I have to look at it again. But what he talks about is how during his life he's had a lot of failures, what he learned from each one of them. And then he learned how to have systems instead of, he said, goals don't quite do it. You've got to have a system about how you do things. And very, very interesting. He called it one time the sandwich method, which I thought was perfect, where in his case, he said, for instance, I just thought I had to build something out of the things that I could do. I was not great at any one thing, and most people aren't either. So the people that are great at any one thing, great boxers, great football players, whatever, they get pretty rare when you compare them to the rest. You can have people that are very good at it, but they don't make a lot of money. People that are really good at it make all the money, it seems like. So he was saying that he always was interested in cartooning, but he said, I'm not all that great at drawing. He said, I'm okay at drawing. But I am, I think, he said, pretty good at observing things that are funny and translating them. Of course, his cubicle life was what he was talking about. And so he decided that, hey, look, I can put those two things together and maybe somebody will like it. And that was just an example. But anyway, it's a great loss, frankly. And I'm still keeping my prayers going for Victor Davis Hanson, who's still recovering from lung cancer surgery. Apparently he's doing fairly well, but we can't afford to lose that guy. I mean, we've got too many really great signposts in the conservative movement out there that have been taken from us before their time, and I don't want to see that now. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing places around the country. It's fun to watch all of this kind of craziness, right? No, it's not fun at all. It's disturbing. I mean, what's really going on in places like Minnesota and some of these other places? And there's kind of a difference between just covering it, showing you pictures of it and talking about it in general and understanding it. And we keep getting told, these events are purely about policy or about injustice or politics. But I don't think that explanation really covers it. It doesn't explain why the same patterns keep repeating or why this emotional intensity often outpaces the facts, right? Why are they so upset sometimes? You look at that. These people are so unconnected to what they're protesting about, and they're just out of their minds, right? There's a human side to that, and it explains some of the violence. It doesn't excuse it, of course. People have grievances, and they can, have bona fide grievances, But that doesn't mean that they should be translated into violence. How do we get there? Violence and disorder really are rarely just messages, really just protests. That doesn't really happen that much. There's some sort of emotional release. And we see these events, particularly in Minnesota. It's cold in Minnesota, right? I mean, this is not a good time to be out wandering around at night, fighting with police. Well, the police apparently are standing down, but ice and pounding on cars and things like this. Not the best weather to do it, but these people manage to get themselves worked up to go do it. And when you look at them talking about this, their connection to what's being protested is kind of distant. So what's going on? It's something important. When, people move from just protest to confronting with the police and attacking, it's a sign that it's symbolic. It's not about policy and what happened. It's about emotionality, right? The event now has some resonance in these people. It's some emotion. It's not really about policy anymore. Doesn't mean that their concerns aren't real. It's just that it's no longer about what happened. It's about what that event represents. And I think a lot of it goes back to this anxiety, dissatisfaction, loss of identity that we see in groups of people. I mean, over the last decade, if you guys look at these surveys that come out, there's all this rising anxiety. People are dissatisfied for reasons they can't really name. And it really is more prevalent among younger adults and women. I mean, it's not a moral judgment. It's just that's what the social reality studies tell us. I think there's a growing body of research out there that anxiety and dissatisfaction, particularly among younger people and women, it's much higher than it used to be. I mean, I think that's clear. And it's partly because this environment that they're in is so destabilized. You know, when people feel anxious or uncertain or unmoored, they look for some kind of meaning, and movements, any kind of movement can provide that. I'm not saying mental illness causes political activism. I'm saying that anxiety makes people more vulnerable to movements that promise some kind of clarity, that somehow that participating in them makes you virtuous, that you belong to something. We'll talk some more about this in the show today. There's, I think, some real truth to this and some real observations to learn from. When people get involved with these kinds of things that are going on, it offers some kind of moral certainty. They feel some sort of permission now because they're virtuous, so they're free to step further and exercise whatever emotional problems they're feeling at the time. And that release gets out of control. And one of the most powerful things that some kind of movement, like dissatisfaction with ICE or attacking President Trump or whatever, can do is tell you that acting on anger isn't just understandable. It's righteous. That shouting and beating on cars, that's courage. Disruption is justice. And not doing it is some sort of complicity in what you're fighting against, which gets very difficult for people to explain when you try to nail them down. This whole silence is support or something. It doesn't make sense in most of these situations. Now, when that happens, I mean, all this conduct that even the people doing it would usually find unacceptable gets reframed as it's a moral action. Right? It's them acting better than other people. And that's when things start sliding fast into disorder. The media amplifies this stuff. The more that they act out, the better television, news, whatever it makes, so they get more coverage. And that charges up these emotional releases because they see it. And it works them up even more. And it creates this repetition, creates all this that they think, oh, everybody's on our side because we keep seeing so much of it. That's not what's happening. But when they're charged up like that, that's what people think. People think that repetition is truth. It's the same thing when you read the news. Just because the mainstream media says something 8 times and media that you might trust more says it twice, doesn't mean that the 8 times is right. It just means they're saying it more. So when you get a narrative that's amplified nonstop, what do you get? You get this illusion that what's going on is correct in some way, that everybody's on board with this. And that's not true. A stable society doesn't pretend people aren't anxious. But it doesn't tell them their anchor is sacred and they can outsource it in something like this. And we'll talk a bit more about that, but it's really worth watching. All right, we're back. Thanks for sticking around, folks. You know, the rest of the show I wanted to talk about something that I reference a lot and we've talked about before over the years, but I don't think it can ever be discussed enough. And when we see what's going on now, it just seems so timely. And, all right, we're back. Thanks for sticking around, folks. You know, the rest of the show I wanted to talk about something that I reference a lot and we've talked about before over the years, but I don't think it can ever be discussed enough. And when we see what's going on now, it just seems so timely. And I'm talking about a short, uncomfortable book in many ways. Great to read, but I mean, the discussion is something that really makes us tune into the troubling parts of human behavior. It was written in 1951, and that explains mass movements better than most of this modern political commentary you'll read. It's called The True Believer. We've talked about that before in the past. We can't talk about it enough, really. As I point out, that term, the true believer, comes from this book. It wasn't a term like we use it now before. And the author of that is Eric Hoffer. And Eric Hoffer wasn't a professor or some sort of, pointy head, as people used to say, anything like that. He's a longshoreman. And before that, he'd been a migrant worker in California, picking crops up and down the coast just at the end of the Depression. But he happened to be somebody who was just really, really smart and really interested. And he educated himself through this. And his personal story, which it really isn't in the book at all, but if you go look it up, I mean, as he would go work these places, work the fields, picking fruit and vegetables, and then eventually working as a longshoreman in San Francisco, he would go to the libraries and he would study. No TV, no sitting around doing something else. He was fascinated by human behavior and what was going on around him and trying to figure out what motivated people. And he watched people very closely, and he noticed patterns that he thought repeated. Every time society became, or cultures became anxious, frustrated, and eventually kind of unmoored, like we talked about, he noticed some of the same things, and the same people, and the same things were happening over and again. What he wanted to know is what makes, in many instances, ordinary people abandon their own judgment and attach themselves to some sort of movement, political, religious, ideological, even cultural. What he was talking about is, it's not evil leaders so much, or stupidity, although that's what it feels like when you listen to people sometimes. It's some kind of psychological need that groups of people have, certain kinds of people. Mass movements are about identity, according to him. Not the ideas themselves, but identifying with something. People don't join these movements like we see in Minnesota and stuff because what they're protesting against is all that persuasive. Many of them join because that cause offers some escape from the burden of their own life, that they, or as they perceive it. They're frustrated, and they want relief from anxiety, personal failure, just a lack of meaning, and they're looking for it. And so these causes, they supply identity, right? And they usually apply certainty. This is right. This is what we're doing is virtuous, so on and so forth. And it gives people moral permission to act out with their frustration. So we're talking about in the first segment. And a mass movement doesn't ask you to prove yourself. It asks you sort of become dissolved into the movement, and you become a representative of the movement. You're not yourself anymore, or certainly not yourself like you used to be anymore. Now you're something else because you're part of this movement, this idea. So what happens out of that is that people who are involved in it, and this is why we sometimes think they're stupid, but it's not that so much. Some of it is, of course, because the movements don't ask you to be a thinker. They just want you to be a joiner. And there are different types of people. There are people we know that are creative or practical, and then there are people that are susceptible to this because they're unhappy with themselves, unhappy with their lot, and sometimes it's just self-created. If you looked at them, you wouldn't think their life was that bad, but for some reason they do. And they want some sort of certitude in their lives because they've questioned their existence, their beliefs, whatever the case may be. And so they like absolutes, and that's what these things give them. And it gets to the point where any kind of doubt, any kind of change, any kind of deviation from the rigors of the movement is somehow a betrayal to it. You see this where as these movements go on, against ICE, this, that, the BLM movement, whatever the case may be, it gets to the point where any deviation from what becomes the standard liturgy out there is not just like, well, we agree on most things, we don't agree on that. No, you are out. Everything has to be absolute. Because if you're a true believer, you have to belong. And if you belong, you have to agree with everything. You know, and social media doesn't help this. It lets people experience things as a group too fast, less judgment. And then everybody has these purity tests, because in social media you can start talking about things like, well, so-and-so said this, and that's obviously deviation from this. And you get this going. And pretty soon you're either with us or against us. That's how they all end up. And you see that. They're not rational expressions of will. They are fused together as an expression of belonging to something else entirely. And here's the funny thing, is because sometimes we see these same people at all these different protests. Now, we think they have something in common because they're usually from what we call the left side of politics. But you look at some of them and they're like, yeah, people on the left seem to be wired up in this, but what do these things have to do with one another? Well, you can be grounded in more than one of these things so long as they have sort of commonality between them. And people can jump from doctrine to doctrine so long as it gives them what they're looking for. Some emotional structure, a need for enemies, right? Because if you have enemies, then you don't have to concentrate on yourself. You just have to think about all those people out there that, are against you. And being against you, of course, is against being virtuous, because you're virtuous, because you're part of a movement that is ideologically bounded in being right. Whose definition of that, of course, is what we're talking about. But that's how it all comes. It comes to this point. And because you're involved in it, you get some kind of redemption in the struggle. That's why when you see people struggling out there and you think, well, what are they doing? Why are they? Well, the more they're struggling and the more they're fought against, the more convinced they are they must be right. Because a struggle is sort of redemption. Well, I'm fighting against evil. If nobody cared about it, you wouldn't see many of these people. People can move from point to point in these kinds of things, not because they change their beliefs or that they have all of these beliefs at the same time, but because these beliefs fill the same need. So when you read The True Believer here, and I encourage everybody to. I was looking at my copy today before I came down here, and it's 170 pages. It's not big. You can read it in a day, and you probably will, because once you start reading it, you start seeing what is the most revealing thing about some sort of literature or program or speaker or whatever that says something that really resonates with you is you start going, oh yeah, I see that. It isn't that it's so complicated. It's not some sort of mathematical theorem you have to sit and work out on a piece of paper or type into the computer. It's something that someone else who is very bright and very observational has thought about, and he's not teaching this, he's revealing it. Victor Davis Hanson talks about sometimes when he was discussing Biden, he said something I thought was pretty deep, where he would say, look, with some people, age doesn't change them. It reveals them. They lose their inhibitions, and they start letting you see who they really are when they're somebody like Biden. Bitter, angry, feels insignificant, so he has to talk about how great he is, all that stuff. That starts coming out. Because they've been around long enough to where they just lose their, all of us get less inhibited as we get older to some extent. Well, as most of us do. And that's kind of what happens in these things, is it becomes revelation in some way. You're reading it, and you're just nodding, and you're going, oh, yeah, no, yeah, I see that. And it's like, oh, this all comes together now. Not because it's complicated, but because it's kind of simple when somebody studies it and like puts it all together. It's like the turnings we talk about, the turnings of society, the fourth turnings, the four turnings, I should say, of where society goes through. It's generational, right? Every 25 years or so, 25 years, a new generation comes along, and their connection to the past is further away, and they understand where they come from less and less until finally they just ditch the whole thing, and there's some sort of realignment. It's sort of like that. I mean, you're sitting there and you're thinking, okay, I get that. And that's what the book's all about. We'll be right back, folks. I just don't think we can talk enough about what motivates people to do the things they're doing now, like in Minnesota. Oh, gosh, what they did, BLM before that, and we had the hands up, don't shoot situation. It goes on and on. And as you get more and more lost people in society, the more you see it. It doesn't mean that you're stuck with it. It just means that's what's happening. And if you understand it, maybe you can do a little something about it. We can maybe have politicians that we elect that understand it a little better and understand what needs to be done, which is a little bit of backbone has to be shown, and not work in a way that validates these movements. Certain types of resistance to them just validates them. Doesn't mean you have to run wild. But sometimes you can't treat them as serious people. You can treat them as a dangerous cause. But I don't think you can give them too much energy to what they're trying to talk about, because they're not really trying to talk about that. The situation has to be contained. And eventually what happens with a lot of them, if they're not resisted enough, if they're contained, they find something else. Another cause, another ideological pursuit. It doesn't go away. They don't get better. They just move on. And it's a little bit like containing the Soviet Union under Ronald Reagan. You can't go in there and change it. The problems are internal. You have to try and keep, well, in that case, the Soviet Union from expressing its internal conflicts, problems, and economic issues outward. And then it will, of its own accord, find some other way internally. I think that's kind of what we have to do. It's not easy. You have to find that fine line between ignoring them and protecting yourself from them. That's going to be a situational thing. I'm not sure that I have a lot of great advice about that, because I don't think it's easy. I think you have to choose very carefully when you respond and when you let them stew a little bit, as my grandmother used to say. And without pushback in some of these areas, they sort of fall apart and they go to something else, just as ideologically wild as the last thing were, or related to it, or another town, another issue, another place to shake their fists at people and ignore their own problems. But trying to protect yourself from them when they get more and more wound up is it's difficult to walk that line, because too much resistance gives them energy, convinces them that they're right. Well, this is what happens. This is why we're being repressed. See the violence inherent in the system? You mean your violence? No, we're just standing up for ourselves. That's the other. So there's a uncomfortable nuance that takes place trying to respond to these things. And I'm not sure everybody has it. I think we just have to keep looking for it when we're in these areas. Try and find the least confrontational alternative we can. Now, when things get to a certain point where there's real danger, when people are getting hurt, you have to respond positively and strongly. But trying to find some way to just sort of contain these people and let them, yeah, have your say. Go ahead out there. Can I bring any water or anything? What's the story here? If you can get it boiled down to that, ignore their name calling and everything else they do, it helps keep them from winding themselves up into more and more violence. And part of the problem is, of course, that mixed in with these people that are ideologically lost, trying to cling to some sort of movement, are really bad actors. They're people that have another agenda altogether. There's less of them, but they're mixed in. And, of course, they want this to accelerate because these lost folks that are out there for reasons they're not even quite sure about, they're a shield for these agitators who they do know what they're there for. Now, it may not make any sense to us, but there's plenty of them out there that think if they can just tear down society, that they can rebuild it in an image that will be so much better. And you think, oh, surely they'll see that doesn't work. Well, no. It never works that way. No one ever sees that their ideas were bad on these kinds of things. They just think they didn't have enough of something. Enough of your money, enough power, enough time, too many Republicans opposing them, whatever the case may be. And you see that. Let's look at New York. Mondami's housing czar, if you want to call her that. The woman who thinks that we should all live in public housings. And I'm not just extrapolating that. That's pretty much what she says. She doesn't like private property. She thinks, well, I should live in, basically supplied housing. And it's just an outgrowth of that everything is a right. And since it's a right, somehow government has to supply it. Not allow you to have access to it. See, there's the difference. Allowing you to have access to being able to become a homeowner, to have a job, to do all these other sorts of things, that's pretty much what liberty is all about, and it's what our Constitution is about. If you conflate that enough, pretty soon you come up with the idea that, well, everybody should just have it. That the government should supply it. If it's a right, then they should, make sure that it's, no, that's not the same thing. But you can see how you can cross that bridge. I think what we're seeing now is that turning again after World War II. We talked about where World War II was sort of like, we call it the greatest generation or whatever, but the people who fought, the world was in tumult. They settled it. They came back. They did some good things. See, it doesn't necessarily have to go that way, but they did. They came back. A lot of them were not in great shape. They saw some terrible things, but they settled down. They got families. They built a country. And then the next generation kind of felt removed from that, right? And then that's how that goes. And by the time you get to the fourth generation, they don't have any idea why any of that happened, and they think that it's all baloney because they have a lot of better ideas, because they haven't gone through anything. So people who observe this stuff up close, the real results of this, people who get to really observe fascism, communism, dangerous movements of any kind, they see the patterns. I mean, go ask some Cubans in Miami about where advanced socialism leads. I'm happy to tell you, if they don't, their parents will, because that's what they left. Talk to somebody from Eastern Europe who, until late in the 20th century, were satellites of a failing economy and a lousy system that started off with the idea that, oh, we're all going to divide everything up. Everything's going to be great. We'll share everything. And I'll be happy to tell you how that turns out. But if you don't have any experience with that, that is not going to happen. I mean, it doesn't mean that you can't have movements, some of which that do great things. You can have movements that are strong, and we have them here. I think we have movements that are counteracting a lot of these that are probably much more beneficial than they are harmful. But it's more about how they form and who they attract. More dangerous kind of movements out there, they recruit from frustration, dissatisfaction. If you notice, most of what's going on, it's not the poor people. It's not what we think of as the truly disadvantaged who's out in the streets. Doesn't that seem strange? Well, not if you're thinking about people that are lost. Someone who's really struggling is really struggling. Now, that doesn't mean they might not lash out at some point in their lives, but they're more interested in trying to survive and get their head above water than they are about worrying about these kinds of things. It's the people above that in the economic ladder usually that are manifesting it. And, it can be social displacement, like people talk about, that they don't feel like they have enough status. They don't think people appreciate them. They see themselves stagnant economically, maybe. But the most dangerous recruits in these things, they're not the poorest. The ones that are the most dangerous are the most disappointed. Those are the ones that are driving this kind of stuff. I mean, you always talk about how you don't want to fight someone that has nothing to lose. But that's still someone who's probably less dangerous than someone who feels like he's been cheated out of something that he's formed in his own mind about why he's not where he thinks he should be. This kind of weird hatred that comes out of these things, it's just a feature of that. It unifies people. It's easier to get people unified against something than it is for something. And you know that. You see that all the time. An external enemy, it makes reality simple, doesn't it? It's them. It's their fault. That's what's going on. And if there's failures, it's because of your opposition. It excuses what you may fail at. And eventually, when you put enough energy into this external enemy, it justifies doing anything you want. And we see that now. Oh, punch a Nazi, do this, do that. Well, where does the permission to do that come from? Well, it's because you're so virtuous, and now you've cornered in your own mind people who are opposing you as being so evil that what we would think of as some kind of cruelty is justified because, well, you're fighting something really evil. Most of the time, that's not the case. But that kind of anger, displacement, hate, like they talk about all the time, people talk about hate speech all the time, seem to be the people that are most motivated by it. And it is a binding agent that we don't like to talk about. Because we like to think people aren't that way. People are that way. Just simply because it's a raw emotion, it's easy to stir up, and it excuses a lot of behavior. And so when you're already disappointed in yourself or what's going on with your own life, you're going to gravitate to that. It gives you a clear villain, right? There's a complex problem out there usually, but you're not interested in solving it that way. That doesn't give you any release. So you want to have everything distilled into this villain. And if you just go after this villain, person, movement, on the other side of you, the institution, whatever the case may be, that's the villain. And that simplifies your problem. You don't have to think too much about it. You just have to go after this one thing or this associated thing. And you see them, and it's not even sides. It's not a left and right thing, but you see it form up against corporations, certain institutions, the system. I always like that. We go back to the 60s and 70s. The man, I'm fighting the man. Who's the man? Well, it was a straw man, really. It was just a creation in people's head that they could solidify into what was opposing them. And then since they were opposing them, and they were because they themselves were virtuous, because they were doing things that were, in their mind, great, then that the man was their enemy, and that everything that happened that didn't go their way was the man's fault. It's sort of silly, but if you look at what people are saying, it's all sort of the same thing. I mean, once you take dislike and you deposit all of this anger, resentment, and personal problems across to a villain, be it another movement, corporation, an institution, whatever the case may be, then restraint about how you behave, it starts to collapse. Now you're in the battle. And the more energy you give to this other side as being the source of all your problems, the more permission it gives you to act out against it. It becomes self-sustaining. It's sort of like a perpetual motion machine, except that it's powered from the inside and the outside. So it's not really like perpetual motion, but you see the energy that happens. The more that restraint collapses from people, and the more the other side fights back, because at some point they have to, then the more energized one side becomes. And that's why trying to isolate this stuff, if possible, is one of the best things. It's like we talk about the cancel culture. What's one of the things that works best against the cancel culture? Is it resisting it? Is it apologizing to it? Is it going into some sort of treatment plan for it? No, it's refusing to be identified with it. Say, that's not what I'm doing. You know that's not what I'm doing, and I'm not going to apologize for it because I'm not doing that. And since I'm not doing that, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to give you the energy, my energy, to do that. And that's hard to do because our natural impulse is to try and say, look, that's not what I meant, and explain. You know, there's that old saying, never complain, never explain. Well, sometimes the explain thing just makes people feel like, aha, yes, well, we were onto the right thing there. So you got this guy now, he's apologizing for it because he was, in fact, doing this. It's a funny thing in society because I think most of us know that if someone does something wrong or they make a mistake, people make mistakes all the time, all of us do, that someone says, I made a mistake, I recognize that mistake, I wish I hadn't have made it, and I'm seriously and regretful of it, and I'd like to learn from that and move on if I can. People will be amazingly forgiving in that situation. But if you decide to say, yes, you were right. I was motivated by some ism, some sort of hate speech, and you didn't, whatever it is, they label you with. But now I've learned, now we know, right? You've admitted that's what the problem was. That's the kind of person you are. You're trying to weasel out of it now, so we're just going to pile on a little bit more. And you see that again and again. I mean, the impetus is to say, well, I'll just apologize and it'll go away. Well, that's not enough when you're being accused of something like that, because the apology gives them energy, gives them the idea that they were right to begin with. And if they're right to begin with, you can't admit it because it's not true. And the minute you start working with things that aren't true, it becomes a problem for you. As we've said before, and this is something that Douglas Murray has, I think, encapsulated by saying that one of the worst things you can do to people is force them into a system where they're told they must believe and support things they know not to be true. That's an incredibly corrosive type of thing to the human spirit. And it happens all the time. The more authoritarian societies get, the more radical they become. We will talk about the French Revolution in that regard a lot. And anytime you study it, the more you look into the first couple of years of the French Revolution, the more you see this. It becomes so apparent. And if we understand it a little better, like I think we do, then we can deal with it. It isn't that we're saying that, and Hoffer wasn't saying that you can't believe in anything, but the faith you have, true faith you have, is grounding. Fanatics are trying to escape something. Fanaticism requires constant reinforcement. That's what we're talking about, trying to isolate it. They can't tolerate humor or irony. That's why I'm making fun of them. It's so infuriating and actually effective. And you have to have public displays of loyalty. You have to have the little badge you have to wear when you're at the awards show, the little sort of emotional moments you have to have decrying something that doesn't have anything to do with you, and you clearly don't understand it anyway. But that kind of public loyalty makes people think, oh, well, we're on the same side, because it's sort of self-surrender. And self-surrender with these people, or many of these types of people, it feels virtuous, and it removes accountability. It's like, oh, here's who I am. I'm loyal to this, and then I'm not accountable to anything because I'm part of this movement. When personal responsibility disappears, then being violent and cruel becomes righteousness in some people's mind. Now, Hoffer, if you read The True Believer, and I really hope you do, because you can find it so many different places. Obviously, you can order it online. Some of the libraries have it. Go to a bookstore. There's one around there. They're not even very expensive because it's been in publication for so long. And if my experience with it is anything, you'll read it, and it will change how you see things pretty much every day. And you'll want other people to see it. You'll do like I do, probably, which I bought several copies of and given it to people. And some of them who have read it, even if half of them read it, get something out of it, you feel like you've revealed something. At least people are understanding. It's the best you can hope for. People who are leaders out there, these movements, for instance, they don't create them from nothing. The movement gets going from a certain level of dissatisfaction, and these people jump in front of it. Some of them understand what's being said, and they solidify it, and they're really just opportunists. Most of them don't actually believe what they're leading, but they see that it can take them someplace. And they begin to just echo the grievances, and they want to amplify the resentment. And everything's a simple narrative. If only we taxed the rich people, everything would be okay. If only the billionaires were going away. Yeah, that doesn't help. That's why lots of times just removing a leader all by itself, having a leader taken out of a movement, doesn't really stop it. Because as much as they exemplify it, they're a product of it, or they're using it for something. They're not leading it, really. Anyway, hopefully you'll read that and get something out of it, and that's how we move on. You guys have a great weekend.